When Hannah McBride inherited her grandmother's house in the small, forgotten town of Ashcroft, she thought it was a blessing. The old Victorian manor stood at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to whisper with ancient secrets. But it was the garden that captured her attention the most, a sprawling maze of flowers and hedges that her grandmother had tended with obsessive care. Hannah had fond memories of playing in the garden as a child, but something about it felt different now. The air was thick with the scent of roses, but there was an underlying stench, something metallic and foul that she couldn't quite place. The locals avoided the house and whispered stories of strange happenings, but Hannah dismissed them as superstitions. She was determined to restore the house and make it her new home, unaware of the horrors that lurked just beneath the surface. On her first night in the house, Hannah was awakened by a soft rustling sound coming from the garden. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The night was still, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. She crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The garden was bathed in the pale light of the moon, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. But then she saw a figure moving through the hedges, gliding silently like a ghost. It was tall and thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved. Hannah gasped and stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. She wanted to believe it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Hannah decided to explore the garden. She pushed through the heavy wrought iron gate and stepped onto the winding paths that snaked through the greenery. The flowers were in full bloom, their colors vibrant and rich, but there was something off about them. The roses, once a delicate shade of pink, were now deep red, their petals streaked with what looked like dried blood. As she walked deeper into the garden, she noticed that the plants seemed to be growing faster, almost unnaturally so. Vines twisted and coiled around the statues, and the hedges had grown thick and wild. The deeper she went, the stronger the metallic scent became, until she reached the heart of the garden, a clearing with a stone fountain at its center. The water in the fountain was dark and murky, and as Hannah leaned in to get a closer look, she noticed something floating just beneath the surface, a clump of wet, matted hair. That night, the whispers began. They were soft at first, barely audible, but as the hours passed, they grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the garden, carried on the wind like a dark secret that refused to be silenced. Hannah tried to ignore them, but they wormed their way into her mind, filling her with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She started to see things out of the corner of her eyeshadows that moved when they shouldn't, figures lurking in the corners of her vision. The garden seemed to be alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seeped into the house and into her dreams. In her nightmares, the garden was a twisted labyrinth of thorns and blood. The vines reached out to her, wrapping around her ankles, dragging her deeper into the darkness. And always, she could hear the whisper, soft, seductive, and filled with malice. Hannah knew she couldn't stay in the house without understanding what was happening in the garden. She decided to dig, to uncover the secrets that her grandmother had kept hidden. Armed with a shovel, she ventured into the garden, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She started near the fountain, where the scent of blood was strongest. The earth was soft and damp, and it didn't take long before her shovel struck something hard. She dug frantically, her hands trembling, until she unearthed a small wooden box, old and rotting with age. The box was locked, but the wood was so decayed that it crumbled under her touch. Inside, she found a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and as she unfolded the first letter, she saw that it was written in her grandmother's handwriting. The letter spoke of a curse, one that had been placed on the garden long ago. The land had once belonged to a wealthy plantation owner who had used it to bury the bodies of the slaves he had tortured and killed. Their restless spirits had seeped into the soil, tainting it with their blood and anger. The garden had been their prison, and over time, it had become something far more sinister, a living entity that fed on the souls of the dead. That night, the whispers grew louder, more desperate. They filled Hannah's mind, driving her to the brink of madness. She knew she had to leave, to escape the garden's grasp, but she couldn't bring herself to go. It was as if the garden had wrapped its roots around her soul, binding her to the house and the horrors that lay within. As she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and they stopped just outside her door. Her breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was the same figure she had seen in the garden on her first night, a tall, thin man with long limbs and eyes that glowed a sickly crimson in the darkness. He didn't speak, but she could feel his gaze on her, cold and predatory. Hannah tried to scream, but no sound came out. The man stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. She could see his face now, pale and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into her very soul. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and bony, and touched her cheek. His skin was cold, like ice, and where he touched her, she felt a burning pain that spread through her body like fire. She wanted to move, to run, but she was paralyzed, trapped by his gaze. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was his twisted smile, his teeth sharp and yellowed, as he leaned in close and whispered in her ear. When Hannah woke up, she was no longer in her bed. She was lying on the cold, hard ground of the garden, surrounded by the twisted vines and blood-red roses. The man was gone, but she could still feel his presence, lurking just beyond the edge of her consciousness. She tried to stand, but her legs were weak and her body ached with a pain that seemed to come from deep within. She stumbled through the garden, the world around her spinning and warping as if she were in a nightmare. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled her mind and drowned out her thoughts. She could feel them pulling at her, dragging her deeper into the garden, into the heart of the darkness that lay within. As she wandered through the garden, Hannah stumbled upon an old, weathered gravestone hidden among the flowers. The name on the stone was barely legible, but she could make out the date over 100 years ago. She knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the letters carved into the stone. It was then that she noticed something strange. The soil around the grave was loose, as if it had been recently disturbed. Her heart pounding, she began to dig, her hands clawing at the earth. The soil was cold and wet, and it stuck to her fingers like blood. She dug deeper, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, until she uncovered a skeleton. The bones were old and brittle, but they were unmistakably human. And there, among the bones, she found something else, a locket, tarnished and worn, with a small photograph inside. It was a picture of her grandmother, taken when she was young. The sight of it sent a chill down Hannah's spine. What was her grandmother's locket doing here, buried in this ancient grave? Desperate for answers, Hannah turned to the letters she had found. They spoke of a ritual, one that could cleanse the garden of its curse and free the souls trapped within. But the ritual was dangerous, requiring to sacrifice something of great value to the one performing it. Hannah knew what she had to do. She gathered the necessary items and made her way to the clearing in the garden, where the fountain stood. The water was still dark and murky, but she could see something moving beneath the surface, something that watched her with malevolent eyes. She began the ritual, reciting the ancient words from the letters, her voice shaking with fear. The air around her grew cold, and the wind howled through the trees like the wails of the damned. The garden seemed to come alive, the vines twisting and writhing as if in agony. As she reached the final part of the ritual, she took the locket and held it over the fountain. The water bubbled and hissed, and she could feel the presence of the spirits all around her, their anger and pain pressing down on her like a physical weight. With trembling hands, she dropped the locket into the water. The ground beneath her shook, and the fountain erupted in a spray of blood and water. The spirits screamed, their voices a chorus of rage and despair, as they were pulled into the void. When the ritual was over, the garden was silent. The air was thick with the scent of blood, but the whispers were gone. The flowers had withered, their vibrant colors fading to a sickly gray, and the vines had stopped their relentless growth. Hannah stood in the clearing, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had freed the spirits and cleansed the garden, but at what cost? The locket was gone, and with it, the last connection to her grandmother. As she made her way back to the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The garden was quiet, but the darkness that had taken root there wasn't gone. It had merely been driven deeper, hidden away, waiting for the right moment to return. Days turned into weeks, and Hannah tried to move on with her life. But the garden's hold on her was stronger than she had realized. She began to see things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures standing in the darkness of the house. At night, the nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, the sound of the whispers echoing in her mind. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison, and the garden was its warden. Hannah's mental state deteriorated. She became obsessed with the garden, spending hours wandering its twisted paths, searching for something she couldn't quite name. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, consumed by the darkness that had taken root in her soul. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. They spoke of blood and sacrifice, of a darkness that could not be purged. They called to her, urging her to give in, to become one with the garden, to let it consume her completely. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, a visitor came to the house. It was an old woman, hunched and frail, with eyes that gleamed with a knowledge that made Hannah's skin crawl. The woman introduced herself as Margaret, a friend of her grandmother's. She had heard about the strange happenings in the garden and had come to offer her help. Hannah, desperate for answers, invited her in. Margaret spoke of the garden's dark history, of the curse that had plagued the land for generations. She told Hannah that the ritual she had performed had only angered the spirits, driving them deeper into the earth where they festered and grew stronger. Margaret revealed that there was only one way to truly cleanse the garden, to destroy it completely. But doing so would require a final sacrifice, one that would bind the darkness to the land forever, preventing it from spreading beyond the garden's borders. Hannah knew what she had to do. The thought of sacrificing herself filled her with dread, but she couldn't let the darkness continue to grow, to consume more innocent lives. She prepared herself for the final ritual, knowing that it would be the last thing she ever did. The night of the ritual was dark and stormy, the sky filled with black clouds that blotted out the moon. Hannah stood in the clearing, surrounded by the withered remains of the garden, as she lit the torch and set fire to the hedges. The flames roared to life, consuming the dry, brittle plants with a ferocity that took her breath away. The fire spread quickly, engulfing the garden in a sea of flames. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning flesh. As the garden burned, the spirits screamed, their voices a cacophony of pain and rage. Hannah could feel their anger, their desperation, as they were consumed by the flames. But she could also feel something else, a sense of relief, of release, as if the spirits were finally being freed from their torment. The fire raged for hours, and by the time it finally burned itself out, the garden was nothing but a smoldering ruin. The once beautiful flowers were reduced to ashes, and the twisted vines were charred and blackened. Hannah stood in the center of the clearing, her body trembling with exhaustion. The garden was gone, but the darkness remained, buried deep within the earth. She could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. As she turned to leave, she heard a soft whisper, carried on the wind. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down her spine. The darkness wasn't gone, it had merely been driven deeper, hidden away, waiting for the right moment to return. Hannah left Ashcroft, leaving the ruins of the garden behind. She moved to a new town, a new life, trying to forget the horror she had witnessed. But the memories haunted her, the whispers never truly leaving her mind. She tried to move on, to live a normal life, but the darkness had taken root in her soul, and it refused to let go. She became a recluse, avoiding people, avoiding the outside world, afraid of what she might see. Years passed, and the garden was all but forgotten. The house fell into disrepair, abandoned and left to rot. But the darkness that had once consumed it was still there, buried deep within the earth, waiting. One night, a group of teenagers, curious about the old stories, decided to explore the ruins. They laughed and joked as they wandered through the overgrown paths, unaware of the danger that lurked beneath their feet. As they reached the clearing, they felt a sudden chill in the air. The ground beneath them trembled, and the wind howled through the trees like the wails of the damned. The whispers began, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. The garden, once a place of beauty and peace, was reborn in darkness. The vines, once withered and dead, sprang to life, twisting and writhing like snakes. The flowers, once vibrant and colorful, bloomed in shades of black and crimson, their petals streaked with blood. The teenagers, trapped in the garden, screamed as the vines wrapped around them, dragging them down into the earth. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices filled with malice and rage. The garden had been reborn, and with it, the darkness that had once consumed it. The curse had not been broken, it had merely been biding its time, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Hannah, now an old woman, felt a chill run down her spine as she sat in her small, cramped apartment. She hadn't thought about the garden in years, but suddenly the memories came flooding back, filling her with a sense of dread. She knew, deep down, that the darkness had returned. It was only a matter of time before it found her, before it consumed her completely. The whispers began, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They filled her mind, driving her to the brink of madness. She knew she couldn't escape. There was no running from the darkness that had taken root in her soul. As the shadows closed in around her, Hannah realized with a sinking dread that she would never be free. The darkness had claimed her, and there was no escape. The garden had returned, and with it, the eternal darkness.